Hey, Joe Walsh here. Is this the moment in America to finally do something about mass shootings? We'll talk about it when Freedom returns at 5.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. And so what's this I hear? Did Donna Brazile try and slip these kids questions for that CNN town hall yesterday?
Well, there's a kid. He's a junior. He's in ROTC there. ROTC, excuse me. And he shielded people from gunfire. And he wanted to attend last night's CNN town hall meeting. So they asked him, in order to be, up on the big red stage, I don't know if you saw, but in center stage, wears a velvety red floor, and that's where students who passed the test, I guess, were allowed to sit and ask questions. And the test was you had to write an essay, and then you had to submit questions that you wanted answered. And apparently they didn't like his answers because instead of letting him on stage, they said, well, we'll let you on if you read these questions or if you ask these questions.
CNN had originally asked me to write a speech and questions, and it ended up being all scripted. I don't think that it's going to get anything accomplished. It's not going to ask the true questions.
Yeah, so he wanted his questions answered, and they're like, no, why don't you ask these instead?
He wanted questions about school safety. He suggested using veterans as armed school security guards, but that wasn't the direction CNN wanted
and this
to
is
go.
a kid who is a hero. He used his body to save the lives of others, shielding others. And they didn't give him the dignity or respect to be on stage?
It sounds about right. For more on this topic, because one of the things that's been suggested as a root cause here, fundamental, toxic masculinity. It's our patriarchal culture that breeds monsters like the Parkland school shooter. We're going to put that question to our friend who we've had on the program before. He is Dr. Leonard Sax. He's a MD and PhD. And he's the author of a number of very popular books, including this one, Boys Adrift, which was recommended to me by the guys over at Northridge Prep High School. And then I've heard back from so many people who've subsequently picked up the book who really enjoy it. Boys Adrift is the name of it, the 5 factors driving the growing epidemic of unmotivated boys and underachieving young men. Leonard Sax, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
So what about toxic masculinity? Is this something that we have to be concerned about?
Well, boys want to be men, and girls want to be women. And that's a robust finding, meaning that when anthropologists look at different cultures around the world, they find that that's true everywhere, that seems to be hardwired into our DNA. And every culture takes it seriously. Every culture that lasts, every enduring culture, has a community of men that teach boys how to be men, a community of women that teach women what does it mean to be a woman in this culture. That's true of the Navajo. It's true of Orthodox Jews. It's true in the South Pacific. And it used to be true in the United States. And this is not a guess. It's not nostalgia. We have scholars like Robert Putnam at Harvard who has led an army of graduate students across the United States conducting over 200,000 structured interviews, finding that 30 years ago, 50 years ago in the United States, you drive around any neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon, you'd see a bunch of guys working under the hood of a car. And who were those guys? They were older men, younger men, and boys. 30 years ago in this country, there were many institutions, formal and informal, that taught boys what it means to be a man. It means using your strength in the service of others. Dr. Putnam documents that every one of those institutions has now disintegrated. You drive around a neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon now, you might see 2 old geezers working under the hood of their 65 Corvette, but the teenage boys are not with them. The teenage boys are indoors, more likely in their bedroom, playing out their testosterone-fueled fantasies, whether that's shooting aliens in Halo or looking at pornography. We're not teaching boys what it means to be men, and as a result, boys are constructing masculinity negatively, which is a fancy way of saying that for many boys, being a real man means not doing what girls do. If girls care about turning in the homework and pleasing the teacher, then I won't. If girls are kind and courteous and respectful, then I will be nasty and cruel. And for many boys who've reached the end of their line, and they feel like I'm a total failure in the eyes of the world, I don't have a job, I don't have prospects, I'm going to show them. I'm going to show them that I'm a real man. And for a few boys, that means taking a gun and killing people.
Well, I know I'm very familiar with first-person shooting games. I have two boys, 14 and 13, and they play Fortnite obsessively. So I know that we have to calm that down. But I just feel like we're living in a culture of disrespect. I mean, I don't know if you watched the CNN town hall meeting last night. We're not going to play all of it, but what this junior, Cameron Casey, listen to how he treated Senator Marco Rubio.
Senator Rubio, it's hard to look at you and not look down the barrel of an AR-15 and not look at Nicholas Cruz. But the point is, you're here, and there are some people who are not.
I mean, that is unbelievably disrespectful. I know that he's grieving, and people process that differently, but is that an example of a lack
absolutely.
of respect?
And the first chapter of my book, The Collapse of Parenting, is titled The Culture of Disrespect. The culture in which American kids are now raised. It's a very different culture than American culture was just 20 years ago. And, you know, I wrote recently about the Grammy Awards, and this actress gets up and gives this passionate speech about how the time for sexual harassment is over. And then they gave the Grammy for Best Song to Bruno Mars for his song, That's What I Like, where he says, baby girl, what's happening? You and your blank invited, turn around and drop it for a player. He's offering this woman money and jewelry in return for anal sex. And that's the best song of the year. It's a big change. We are celebrating sexual harassment and disrespect in our songs when at the same time we're trying to teach kids not to do this. So the culture's become very confusing for kids. Boys don't know what it means to be a man. Does it mean that you go up to a girl and say, hey, baby girl, how about you turn around and drop it for a player? I'll give you money and jewelry. Because that's the best song of the year, in the opinion of the Recording Academy.
That's a good point.
What does it mean to be a man? How is a boy supposed to know when that's the best song of the year?
Well, I mean, do you have any advice for maybe a mom who's got
Absolutely.
two
That's
kids
what
that
the
are
book
14
Boys
and 13?
is
I mean,
all about.
I make them look me in the eye when they talk to me. I make them say please and thank you all the time, but I don't even know if that's enough. They get good grades, and so that's why they think they can play Fortnite for hours.
So there's a lot of different. There's at least 5 different factors out there that are driving this, and one of them is video games. Mm-hmm. And you should not allow your son to play a game where you are rewarded for killing human beings. But those games happen to be the most popular games in the United States. Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, Fortnite. This is, again, not a guess. We actually have good scholarly research where scientists have followed kids over years and found, okay, this kid's playing Madden NFL football. This kid is playing Fortnite and Call of Duty. Not in a week or a month, but over a year or more. The kid playing the violent game becomes less respectful, less honest, more hostile, less patient. Playing games where you pretend to kill people has consequences, and parents must not allow it. You can't expect your son to do this. When his friend says, hey, come on, let's play Fortnite, let's play Grand Theft Auto, you can't expect a 14-year-old boy to say, oh, well, researchers have found that those games have toxic effects on boys. Come on, that's ridiculous. You have to allow your son to say, hey, I'm not allowed. But I am not allowed.
But I mean, just one point on that, just for clarity's sake. That's not the same thing as saying video games are the proximate cause of school shootings or any other, right? But you're just saying it leads you down a path of not being the kind of man that we want our young men to be.
That's right. Well, what kind of man do we want young men to be? Because, again, boys are now immersed in a very confusing culture where they're told gender doesn't matter, gender's a social construct, gender's anything you want it to be, gender is fluid. Mm-hmm. And this is based entirely in politics. The research utterly contradicts this, and I present that research in my book, Why Gender Matters. And boys want to be men, but the culture is telling them, oh, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because it's not politically correct. But it does matter. And boys are adrift, hence the title of the book, Boys Adrift, trying to figure out on their own what it means to be a man. No enduring culture does that because it's too dangerous. As Margaret Mead said, so the great challenge, Margaret Mead said, for any culture is to figure out what to do with your young men, she said, because if you don't get this right, you are going to have young men who are violent, who are impulsive. The point of the culture is to take that strength and that energy and to channel it into something productive. If you don't do that, then you get bad outcomes, whether that's boys who are not engaged in schoolwork, boys who are spending their free times playing video games or looking at pornography, or in rare cases, boys who are engaged in mindless violence.
And because we haven't done that, as you're suggesting, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, one of the ways we've tried to address the failings, it seems, and a number of our listeners have made this point over the last week as we've talked about the Parkland shooting, is over-medicating young men, is using drugs to remedy what we fail to do in terms of culture and values raising these kids.
That's absolutely right, and that is one of the factors that I address in the book Boys Adrift. In my book, The Collapse of Parenting, I show that American kids are 14 times more likely to be on medication for attention deficit disorder compared to kids in the United Kingdom. They're 40 times more likely to be on medications for bipolar disorder compared to kids in Germany. In this country, medication is the first resort. Outside of North America, medication is the last resort. In this country, we're trying to use medication to make up for our failings as a culture. And my advice to parents as a practicing physician in psychology and psychologist is don't do that. Don't use medication as a first resort. It's very common for American doctors to say things like, well, let's try Adderall and see if it helps, even if the kid doesn't meet diagnostic criteria. Nobody else does that. This is the only country where we use medication as the first intervention with a kid who's having any kind of problem.
Is there any part of you that feels sorry for that Parkland shooter? I mean, his mom just died. He was on medication. He was off his medication, according to his public defender, when the shooting occurred. But somebody like that, they just slipped through the cracks and was able to get a gun.
Well, and that's another big part of the problem. Americans have more guns by far than anybody else, and certainly the numbers suggest that's part of the problem. But you compare the United States to Australia, Americans have about 6 times as many guns per capita as people in Australia, but Americans are 30 times more likely to die in gun violence than people in Australia. So I agree with the gun control people. I think that the access to assault rifles is part of the problem, but it can't explain the whole story. Because even if you somehow got rid of 80% of the guns in this country so that we had the same number of guns per capita as Australians do, we'd still have a death rate from guns that's 5 times higher than Australia. And I think our failure to instruct young men in what it means to be a man accounts for that 5-fold difference.
There was a piece in Reader's Digest earlier this week that we've referenced. It's gotten some play. A guy wrote about his 5th grade son's teacher, who ever since the Columbine shooting goes through this exercise where she asks her 5th grade students to say who do they want to sit next to the following week. And then she puts together all of the responses to try and figure out, who is not being selected. In other words, kind of who's being socially ostracized. Her philosophy is essentially that all violence begins with disconnection, that external acting out or violence begins with inner loneliness. And so she's trying to address that and socialize young boys in her 5th grade class through that approach. Is she onto something?
No, unfortunately,
She's
I don't
not.
think that's going to help. You look at Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the 2 killers at Columbine. Eric Harris was a charmer. Everybody liked him. He had lots of friends. It is not the case that every school shooter, or even most school shooters, is an ostracized loner. But the great majority of these boys are young men who haven't figured out what does it mean to be a man. They may have friends. They may have lots of friends. And Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris were very close to one another. But becoming a man means more than just having a friend. It means figuring out what does that mean and how is it different from being a woman.
That's really interesting. I'm surprised to hear your answer, so now I'm going to have to rethink that. That's really interesting. He is Leonard Sax, as you mentioned. He is a MD and PhD. the book, one of his many books, Boys Adrift, the 5 factors driving the growing epidemic of unmotivated boys and underachieving young men. He also has written The Collapse of Parenting, Girls on the Edge, and Why Gender Matters. Dr. Sax, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks again.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Today, mostly cloudy. Average for this time of year, a high of 39